Hello and welcome. My name is Dr. Neil Soggie, and this is the Week 2 lecture for the course Ancient History, the History of the Ancient Near East and Greece. Earlier on this week, I spoke a little bit about the rise of the city-state of Akkad within Mesopotamia and its rule under Sargon the Great, and I pointed out that Sargon actually means legitimate ruler. And some of the stories around Sargon the Great that became part of what we consider to be archetypal signs of a great ruler throughout history. Some other things that we took a look at were the Curse of Akkad and start of the decline of the city-state of Akkad and its rule and influence, and overall a decline in the wealth and health of the environment within Mesopotamia. We also took a look at the Epic of Gilgamesh. So we have previously covered the time from around 2500 through to the 2330s of BCE of Sargon the Great, and then down into one of the earliest versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh and the rule of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, around 2100 BCE. We also took a look at a little bit of the Great Flood of Enlil that was recorded as part of that. So let's now take a look at this region around 2000 BCE. And one of the places that we get a little bit of information about this time period is from the Bible. Now, what we know from southern Sumer or Mesopotamia at this time was that with the development of agriculture came the development of writing, a form called cuneiform. And with the development of trade came the development of the contract. A written contract became a central part of the psyche of life for the ancient Sumerian. And I want you to note a few things here. First, there was a negotiation. Then there was the making of a deal, and then a contract. And this idea of contractual agreements does not have to be between equal partners. It can be one powerful party saying to another, you do this, and I will do something for you. And this is an important thing to remember because we see this in this time around 2000 BCE as part of the story of Abram. But it also becomes important later on in next week's lecture, about 500 years later. But let's just take a look right now in the book of Genesis. So if you could have a Bible, take a look in Genesis, and you can look up online if you need to. Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through to 4 to start off with, and then we'll look at verses 10 to 20 after that. So, Genesis chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord said to Abram, go from your country, Ur, your people, and your father's household in the land of Ur, to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you, and all peoples of earth will be blessed through you. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he set out from Haran, a region near Ur. He took his wife Sarai, his nephew Lot, all the possessions they had and accumulated, and the people they had acquired in Haran. And they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Now, Canaan is in modern-day Israel. So remember, Ur would be in the southern part of Iraq, moving towards the region of Kuwait. They would have gone up north and then around down south into Israel, or what at the time was called Canaan in the Bible here. And then something else happens. Now, culturally, what we see in the book of Genesis is that the patriarchs of the Hebrew people comes originally from Ur. And we'll see later on that these cultural influences run deep. For example, the Sumerian mythology has a great flood legend, just like Genesis. The book of Genesis has people living for hundreds of years prior to this great flood. The Sumerian legends have lists of kings living for thousands of years prior to the flood. For the Sumerians, the people were partying so much that the gods became annoyed. So they sent the flood to shut the people up. But one of the gods told a man to build a boat to save himself and his family from the flood. In Genesis, the wickedness of the people moved God to send the flood, but he told Noah to build an ark. Here in Genesis chapter 12, we see Abram, who later changed his name to Abraham, moves from Ur on a contract-based vision or promise from the deity Elohim. Now, Abraham lived around 2000 BCE, so that's about 4,000 years ago. So let's see where he ends up. And what ends up happening here is that Genesis 12 verses 10 through to 20, and if you just take a few minutes and you can read that, what ends up happening is that there was a famine in Canaan, and so Abram moves all of his people down into Egypt. Egypt, remember, is the other great power at the time. But as the story goes, Abram's wife, Sarai, was a very beautiful woman, and Abram was afraid that he would be murdered because someone desired his wife. So he asked his wife to pretend that she was his sister, and that way Abram would be treated well, which he was. So this is the original sister act. And what ends up happening is Sarai ends up becoming part of the harem of Pharaoh. But it is soon revealed that Sarai is married to Abram. And Pharaoh is so distraught by this that he sends everybody on their way and doesn't want to have anything to do with this sort of thing. So we see that there is some stories within the ancient world of the traveling back and forth between Ur and Egypt. So we know that there is some cross-pollination going on between these cultures. Now, let's take a look at a few hundred years after Abram, back in Babylon. We have around 1810 BCE, the birth of someone by the name of Hammurabi. Now, Hammurabi was born and was the son of a father and grandfather of the kings of Babylon. One of the main things that Hammurabi does is he takes an unstable collection of city-states and turns them into a relatively strong empire for a period of time that spanned all of Mesopotamia. Hammurabi's lasting contribution on the Western society, however, is a series of 12 stones that were displayed publicly for everyone to see. Okay? And notice the number 12 is important here as far as indicating the rule of law. And that becomes later on next week as we take a look at other rules of law. The other thing that we see in this rule of law is the principle of justice, that the punishment fit the crime. The phrase, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, comes up. And that's something that we thought was only in the Bible, but we now see was predated by the Bible with this law Code of Hammurabi. Now, some other things that the Babylonian Empire, this first Babylonian Empire under Hammurabi did was they encouraged trade. They oversaw agriculture. They oversaw irrigation and building projects. They had a comprehensive tax system to make sure that everyone paid their fair share. And while Hammurabi's father had begun to consolidate rule of some small areas around south central Mesopotamia under this Babylonian hegemony, it wasn't until we have Hammurabi come along that things really expand rapidly. Now, the first few decades of Hammurabi's rule tended to be fairly quiet. They were quite peaceful, and Hammurabi seemed to have been focused upon building public works. He increased the height of the city's defensive walls. He expanded the temples. And in around 1801 BCE, the powerful king of Elam, which straddled the important trade routes to the north, began to invade Mesopotamia. And as they started to push down, they became more and more of a concern for the people in southern Mesopotamia. What ends up happening, because Hammurabi comes in to power around 1790 BCE, we see that he's always mindful of this, even before he becomes king. But when he becomes king, he's busy doing all these building projects. What ends up happening then is that there becomes eventually an alliance between Hammurabi and some other kings. And when it comes time to do battle against the Elamites, Hammurabi realizes that he's really the only one to field a competent military. So he crushes the Elamites. But after doing so, he turns to the other kings and he says, "It's clear that you guys didn't do your share. It's clear that I have the defensive power, and it's clear that I have the military offensive power of the region. Therefore, from now on, you will be vassals of me. You will subjugate yourselves to me." And in essence, they agreed. So from that point onward, we see this Babylonian hegemony that lasts for a few hundred years. Now, we're not going to talk a lot about that, but one of the important things that we do find in this era is that we have this law code passed down to us, and it's a fairly significant find. So around 1771 BCE, Hammurabi decrees a set of laws for every city-state to follow. And these are known as the Code of Hammurabi. the 282 laws, and that sounds like a lot, but it's really not compared to the amount of laws that we have in English common law today. But it's the earliest and most complete legal code that we have from the ancient time. The code served as a model for establishing justice within the culture that influences laws later on, particularly laws established by Hebrew scribes, including what we have in the Bible in the books of Exodus and of Leviticus. The structure of the laws, the way that they are conveyed to the public are very similar, and a lot of the justice principles are very similar. However, while we often think of the Old Testament laws as being rather harsh, if you look very closely at the Code of Hammurabi, they were much harsher as far as physical punishment goes. For example, one of the examples is that if a nun were to walk into a bar, so someone that worked in a temple walked into a bar, they were to be burned to death. Okay, that's fairly severe. But what it does is it outlines some common rules that everyone was expected to follow, including payment for services, including also fines for various offenses. Now, the codes were originally carved on massive monoliths, large black stones that were about 8 feet high, and they were lost from Babylonia in around 1595. Babylon was conquered, and these stones were carried away. And they were carried away to, at least the ones that we found, were carried away to an Elamite city. And they were not rediscovered until 1901. So it's only been the last 115, 120 years that we have known about the Code of Hammurabi. Before that, the Bible was one of the oldest codes that we knew. But now we know that this was a common structure that was there for law codes. Now, the Hammurabi Code is not a complete, total set of laws, but a series of enactments that address specific cases for things like slavery and debt and commercial regulations and marriage and inheritance and management of wealth, and for the punishment of crimes, and for compensation for specific injuries, and for payment for fees of professionals like surgeons and barbers and veterinarians. So, for example, if a slave refused to give the name of the master to someone, then that person had the obligation to bring the slave to the palace, and the palace would do a further investigation and ensure that the slave was returned to its owner. If someone owed a debt, and pledged some grain, and the harvest failed, and the grain did not grow for that year, in that year, the debtor does not need to give a payment to the creditor. And so the debt is forgiven for that specific year. So it's a management of managing debt. That would be one example. Another one would be if a man marries a woman and the woman bears sons, but then the woman dies, The dowry does not revert back to the family of the woman. The dowry now belongs to the sons. Another example would be if a man gets in a fight with another man and puts out their eye, then the man that caused the injury will receive a similar injury. Their eye will be put out. So that's the principle of the eye for the eye. Another one is if a man hits a freeborn woman and she's pregnant and she loses her child, then that man must pay a set fee of 10 shekels for the loss that the woman suffered. So that's a payment for physical injury. If a physician heals a broken bone or a disease within a person, that physician, the patient must pay the physician 5 shekels. And if a veterinarian operates on an ass or an ox and cures that animal, then the owner is required to pay 1/6 of a shekel as a fee for that operation. So the idea here is that there is a common standard for rules dealing with economy, dealing with management of injury, dealing with payment of services, to ensure that there is a common set of rules within society to express justice and fairness and rule of law. And that is the most important thing that we see coming out of the first Babylonian Empire. And we'll stop there with the Babylonian Empire, and we will move on in our lecture for this week to the Minoan civilization next. You take care. Bye-bye.